Hi, this is Allie Eliason for EDL 854, Module 16 case study. This goes along with the case of the missing Booster Club funds. So in summary, the case study that we are going to be discussing today is dealing with Mr. Stevens, who is the principal at George Washington Middle School, where he has no assistant principal right now. They told us that there is a decline in the socioeconomic level of the families that he served, but he does have a very good support system with parents and families and the students that are there at their school. One student, Lucy, has been invited to New York City to cheer with the all-state team, and her mother, Mrs. Bowman, has requested from Mr. Stevens, the principal, that the PTA help pay for the expenses for her to go because she is a student there and they would like to pay close to $800 for her to be able to go to that. Mr. Stevens did deny that request. Mrs. Bowman is very involved in Booster Club and volunteering with student organizations. So she was very adamant that she get the help that she had requested. However, this was not something that Mr. Stevens felt that he could do because the PTA funds were meant just for all students and not just one in particular. Mrs. Bowman does help volunteer at the gate and take admissions. So the big problem that we're facing right now is that she was working at the gate during a basketball game when the sales of the deposit did not match and certain tickets went missing. So our big problem right now, what I know is that Mrs. Bowman, she's a volunteer for the school, has requested that her daughter's trip be funded by the PTA. Mr. Stevens said that it was not appropriate to spend the money that way because it didn't benefit all students and that money from the deposit went missing after Mrs. Bowman worked at the gate. I also know that one of the gentlemen that came to the game paid with a $50 bill, and Mr. Stevens spoke directly with this person because it was near the end of the game when they were letting people in. And so he saw the money himself and made a comment about it. Mrs. Bowman stated that there were 10 tickets that were torn and they were discarded, which correlated with about the amount of money with the $50 bill that went missing. So in the box, there is no $50 bill and there are no tickets to account for the 10 that were supposedly torn. So what I need to know right now are where are the 10 tickets that were torn. Even if they were torn, we should have a policy in place that they are not just discarded, that we need to have proof that that's where they went. I would also like to know where the $50 bill is that I, as the principal, saw but was not in the deposit bag. And I need to know what the policies are for our district for dealing with missing money. There's obviously steps in place to either contact another administrator, the accounting department, authorities. It depends on your school. I'd also want to know if there were other volunteers or other people who may have seen other transactions, if they maybe made change for someone else, or if anyone else had access to the box during this time. So my big plan of action right now would be to report this to the district office. According to my school's plan, it would be taken directly to the district office and they would start an investigation. I would help investigate by reviewing cameras if they were available, speaking with the volunteers that were nearby, and I would definitely want to sit down and have a one-on-one with Mrs. Bowman. Because of the situation with her daughter and the denied request, we would have to be very careful with that situation, making sure not to accuse her, but just asking for her help in figuring out the situation and seeing what light she can maybe shed on that. I would also want to revisit policies and the controls that we have in place. We would want to retrain and have some time set aside so that maybe we have 2 people counting the money from now on, or we make sure that we are keeping tickets that are torn. It sounds like there are a lot of controls in place already that Mr. Stevens is following, like pre-numbered tickets and things like that. So and having the security guard watch him count the money. So just finding and being able to fine-tune some of those policies would be a good start to that. I would also want to talk to the district about getting extra help during the events. Having 450 to 1 administrator seems excessive, especially when the gymnasium for this basketball game is filled to capacity. And maybe seeing if staff could volunteer on a rotating basis, so that we have staff who could sign waivers and agreements that's handling your cash and not just giving trust to parent volunteers in the community. While there is trust and good relationships, we do need to have some of those controls in place just to cover everyone for liability, so that we don't have these situations where you end up pointing fingers and can't prove anything and deteriorating relationships. So that new policy would want to be put into place to keep unused tickets and in the cash box so that they're accounted for, and that would help answer at least that question. So to solve, my resolution would be to get more staff involved. Like I'd said, having staff there, we have a handbook, we have contracts, and we're under a lot more strict guidelines on what we can do and what we can't do, and can sign consent forms and privacy policies, things like that, and work more closely with our administration, whereas dealing with public, that's not always the case. I would also want to make sure that there's a 2-person accounting system for when the money leaves the building. It looked like our principal, Mr. Stevens, and the security guard counted the money, but it had already left the building, and we may have wanted to count. Mr. Stevens could have even counted with Mrs. Bowman and had that conversation right there before they left the building at the end of the night. And I would also want to have parent volunteers do jobs that don't involve money, using staff to handle money and having established training policies for everyone. Like I said before, it sounds like there are some very good policies in place, but they can always be fine-tuned to make sure that everyone is covered for legal and liability reasons. So when I'm debriefing and I'm thinking about this, I think that Mr. Stevens is doing a really good job with limited resources that he has, but he may be overstretched. The case study itself did say that he himself was not able to oversee the finances because he was busy with other administrative tasks. I think he did the right thing in regards to the trip, but I'm pretty unsure as to why the principal was the one making the decision for how PTA spends their money without their input. I guess my understanding was that the principal should only be advisory to the PTA, so it really should have maybe gone to the PTA as a vote, and it could have helped avoid maybe Mrs. Bowman being upset, which I think that there's a possibility that Mrs. Bowman could have been upset about the fact that he wouldn't fund her trip and could have stolen the money, but some of that could have been avoided by not upsetting her and making this a decision through the PTA as a group decision and not just on Mr. Stevens. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting scenario. I feel that the school does have good controls in place and a very strong support system with their community. I do think that there's a need for retraining and a push to have staff volunteer. And I would also like to have a conversation with Mrs. Bowman. I feel like having those personal connections and talking with people one-on-one can maybe help get some answers and avoid tension and finger pointing that sometimes can happen with scenarios like this. And as an administrator, I would really value the support that the community and parents have shown my school. I'm also proud that Mr. Stevens shows he cares about all the students when thinking about how money is spent, and even having an announcement for when Lucy was recognized for her all-state nomination to be able to go to New York. So seems like he's doing a very good job with what he can, with what he has, and that there are just some more conversations that need to take place in regards to how the money is handled. So my reflection on this and how, as a school leader, we can promote effective and efficient management at our school district. In this case, I think that Mr. Stevens was thinking about every student when he made those decisions, making sure not to spend huge amounts of money on just one student. I do know that PTAs sometimes spend money on just one teacher or one classroom, maybe one student group, which can happen, but we try to avoid large chunks of money for just one person. And so maybe putting that to a PTA vote and not just having that decision be made by Mr. Stevens would have helped with that scenario. I do think he has controls in place that limit the chance of fraud or theft, counting the money, using pre-numbered tickets, things like that. But that we need to maybe do some retraining and have staff and two-person checks to help for some accountability. He is using the resources available to the best of our ability, since it does sound like there are only parent volunteers right now. I think asking for help from the district and seeing what they could make available to him, whether it be an assistant principal, a lead teacher, or just being able to give supplemental contracts even for staff to help out with these types of things after hours and outside of contract may help with some of those situations. And I like that he recognizes student success and supports the student's achievement. He very strongly said that, he's very proud of Lucy and he likes that she is achieving as much as she is, and wishes that he could do more to help her. But that was something that he didn't feel the PTA could fund. I think maybe we should help her find outside resources, or at least give her some ideas, or have PTA themselves be the one to take the vote. But I do think that they're also building those relationships with families and community members. There wouldn't be as many volunteers, enough to have 4 people at every activity, according to the case study, if Mr. Stevens didn't have good relationships with those families. So we want to make sure that we handle this with care and some caution on how we go about having conversations about kind of a sensitive topic, so that we avoid alienating people, and making sure that our school is protected and that we still value those people. Overall, I think that this is something that it was $50. If we had a conversation, hopefully we find the money. If not, at least it was only $50, and not a lot more. Because the controls that were in place, it could easily be a lot more if there were not those controls in place, and it could be a recurring thing. So hopefully this is a learning lesson, and maybe with conversation and a little bit of follow-up and retraining, this is something that we can limit from happening in the future. So hopefully this answers your question on our case study. You can see my standards on which this meets above this post. Hopefully everyone has a great rest of their summer, and thank you so much for watching.